Okay, let me tell you another part of my story. Okay, so in 1997, my sister's daughter, my sister's little girl, was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. She was 13 years old. And I'm telling you the story just to kind of give you an idea on how my journey began into realizing, going from being this, you know, son of a general and a real patriotic Israeli to suddenly talking like this and, you know, being an activist. Now, my father, like you heard earlier, my father was a general in the Israeli army. He had already passed away by then, but when Smadar was killed, this was very big news in Israel, not only because there was a suicide attack, but also because this was the granddaughter of a famous Smadar general. And so I was living in America at the time. When I came back to Jerusalem, my sister's apartment was filled with people, Palestinians and Israelis, who came to mourn and to, you know, to express their sorrow, but also lots and lots of reporters. A lot of journalists came, because this was big news. And the things that people always ask are, number one, who's responsible? And number two, how do we get back? How do we revenge? How do we retaliate? How many do we kill? And so on. How do we show them, you know, that kind of thing. And when my sister started talking to people, she said, well, don't talk to me about revenge. Don't talk to me about retaliation. To kill somebody in response to somebody's death is sick and crazy, and I don't want to have anything to do with it, especially a child. So a child dies, and what do? You kill 1,000 other people? Does that even make sense? So she said, I don't want to even hear the idea of revenge and retaliation. It's a sick and crazy idea, number one. And number two, she said, who's responsible? Well, who's really responsible? Who's responsible for the fact that Palestinians are under occupation? Who's responsible for the fact that Palestinians are under oppression? Who's responsible for the fact that we take Palestinian land and Palestinian homes, and we have thousands of political prisoners, and we kill Palestinians in school, and in Gaza, and other places? Who's responsible? And she said, I think the Israeli government is responsible. And she said, I think the Israeli government killed my daughter. Because what do we expect? When you have an occupation and you have oppression, you will have resistance. And some of the resistance will be armed resistance, and some of the resistance, innocent people will be killed. So this became even bigger news, because the world knows that the Israelis are the good guys and Palestinians are the bad guys. The world knows that Israelis want peace and Palestinians are terrorists, and suddenly this Israeli mother has turned everything upside down. She's saying, no, the Israelis are the occupiers and the oppressors, and the Palestinians are the victims. And then what happened to me was, I went back to the United States, and I just couldn't go back to just, you know, living my life. You can't do that. When somebody, a little girl you know, somebody killed, you can't just go back and pretend like nothing happened. So I was looking for people to talk to, and to do something, and to be active. And I was very lucky because I live in San Diego, and I found a group that was an Israeli-Palestinian or a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group. Okay, now I was born and raised in Jerusalem. Okay? And this was the very first time I ever met Palestinians. And in my book, there's a chapter that talks about my journey. And the first line is, my journey into Palestine began in San Diego. It was the first, even though I was born and raised in Jerusalem, I mean, Israelis and Palestinians never meet. Right? Even before there was a wall, we would never meet. So I never met Palestinians. So I was living in the United States. That was the first time I met Palestinians. And number two was the first time that I met Palestinians, and you know what else? We were completely equal. No checkpoints, no permits, no special laws, no curfews. They drove, I drove, I went home, they went home, they could go somewhere, I could go somewhere. We were completely equal. And that was the first time I was ever in a reality where Israelis and Palestinians were completely equal. And that was a really very, very strange and very interesting kind of experience. And then I began learning about the Nakba, and then I began learning about the whole Palestinian side of the story, which was the very first time for me. And then I started coming here, and not just staying on the Israeli part of this country, but realizing actually this country has a whole other name. It's Palestine. And there are all these other people here who are Palestinians, and I grew up here, but I never met them. I don't even speak their language. Well, I do a little bit now. But I know nothing about their language, I know nothing about their story, I've never even been to a Palestinian city. And I started driving into Palestinian cities in Israel and then in the West Bank. And this was a whole kind of new journey for me. And at first I was scared, because as Israelis we know Palestinians want to kill us. And then, you know, when you cross the checkpoints, if you go to Kalandia or some of the big checkpoints, you ever see that big red sign that's a warning sign for Israelis. And that warning sign says that not only is it dangerous, number one, it's dangerous. Number two, you're breaking the law. And number three, you could get killed. And then they have 2 or 3 exclamation marks to make sure that you understand this is very serious. So the first time I crossed Kalandia, or the first time I crossed checkpoint here, what's it called, to Rachel's tomb, I was really scared. But you know, it was interesting because I've crossed it many times now, and every time I cross, nothing happens. Nothing happened. I've been doing this for more than 10 years, 15 years. Nothing happens. I mean, there's traffic and there's cars and people, and I see, you know, students going to school. Nothing happens. So I began to think, why do they have this sign there? I don't see any Palestinians with machine guns. I don't see any Palestinians with tanks. I don't see any Palestinians with F-16s trying to kill me. Nobody really cares if I'm there, if I'm not there. And then I started thinking, so why do we have such a big army, and why do we need the wall, and why do we need the checkpoints if there's really no danger on the other side? Why are they trying to keep us apart? Somebody's trying to keep us apart. And that's exactly why there's a struggle, and that's exactly why I think it's important to continue the struggle and to be active. Now, the last thing I'll talk to you about, this is also how my book ends. So we kind of said in the beginning, it's one country, right? Israel and Palestine is the same country. And after 1967, after the war, when Israel took the West Bank, it really created one state over the entire country. It's the state of Israel, but it has different laws, right? It has special laws for me and special rights for me because I'm Jewish, and different laws, different rights for you because you're Palestinians. So is that okay? It should stay this way?
No.
So where do we go from here? Do you think there's a chance that Israel will one day take out all the settlements and leave the West Bank and have a Palestinian state?
No.
No?
They won't leave. This is it.
So what do we do? Here? What do you guys think? What? It's your life. You're young. You guys, you know, what do you think?
Equal rights.
Okay. Yes.
Just work.
So then what do we do? But should it stay like this?
No.
Well, it's one state now, and Israelis are very happy because they have all the rights, all the water, and all the land. Are you guys happy?
No.
No? So what do you think we should do?
We fight for a country.
How? What do you think? What's the goal? What do you think the goal should be? So like you guys said in the beginning when we talked about it, it's not really a question of bringing about peace because it's not like there's a war. It's more a question of creating a state where there's freedom and democracy as opposed to having occupation, right? Is Jaffa part of Palestine?
No. It is a part of Palestine.
Yeah, it should.
No.
Yeah, that's part of right. Is Haifa part of Palestine? Is the Negev and the Galilee part of Palestine?
Yes.
So in that case, raise your hand if you can go to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. Can you?
With a permit.
No, forget the permit. You want to go to Jerusalem to I don't know, Tel Aviv right now? Can you go?
No.
Some of you can, some of you can't. Does that make sense?
It does make
What
sense.
do you guys think? Huh? So we talked a little bit about the resistance, and we talked about, I think what's really important to decide, to have it clear is what's the goal. If we're not talking about two people fighting and we need a peace, then it's important to realize what is happening and what do we want. And what, have you ever heard the term apartheid? Do you know what it means? Who knows what it means? Yeah, basically when you have a country that has different laws for different people. So this country has different laws for me, I get all the rights. Then they have different laws for Palestinians who actually have Israeli Hawiyah, Israeli ID, right? Israeli citizens. They have different laws. There are lots and lots of different laws that discriminate against them, even though they're citizens. And then there's the laws that you guys live under, which are really military law, right? You guys are under the military occupation. So it's the same state, it's the same country, it's the same government, but they have different laws for different countries. That's why they call it apartheid. So I get some water, you get less water. I get some electricity, you get less electricity. I get some rights, you get no rights. You get less rights. That's how apartheid worked. Anybody hear of South Africa?
Yes.
What happened in South Africa?
Two races.
And then what happened?
Nelson Mandela came along.
What did he do? What changed in South Africa?
United.
What changed in South Africa?
The right.
There wasn't any segregation.
Well, what had to go before it happened?
He changed ideas. Hate.
What was the thing? The system.
Non-violence.
The system of apartheid had to go.
Ah,
The system of apartheid had to go. You know, the system of apartheid, this is why Nelson Mandela was in jail, because he believed that there should be a country where you have each person has the same rights. Black, white, it didn't matter. You know? Do you think that could happen here?
Yes.
Maybe.
Needs.
Who thinks it could happen here where you could have complete real democracy?
Nelson Mandela did it, maybe too.
Huh?
Smadar.
Okay, let me ask you a different way. Do you think this is easier or more complicated than South Africa? Do you think Palestine is easier or more complicated than South Africa? Okay, you're going to have to explain. Somebody raise your hand and explain why. I'm getting the same 2-3 people talk. Let's have somebody else. What are you afraid of? What do you think?
So Israel wants to establish a country.
I'm sorry?
Israel wants to establish a country. They're putting like Palestine together.
So, but do you think it can change? Do you think it's more complicated here than it was in South Africa?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, what do you think over there?
I think it's not a matter of war. It's a matter of confusion because everyone has his own idea and his own decision. People get messed up. So when you have Israeli Zionists and when you have Israel who wants peace, they fight to get off. Like an Israeli Zionist want to kill Palestinians, like the other wants peace. So it's
Right, you're right. But it was similar everywhere. Everywhere you have this kind of a system, it's the same thing. You have people who want to keep the system. And you want people who want peace and equality, right? Let's go back to South Africa. South Africa had an apartheid racist system, and they changed it. Do you think Palestine is more complicated or easier than South Africa? Because if they did it, maybe it can happen here. What do you think?
It's more complicated here because here it's not like South Africa. Here it's like not only Israel and Palestinians are involved. It's the whole kind of powers, world powers against each other, butting heads all the time because of this. Like, for instance, in the US, people are mostly pro-Israel. And if you go like Arab countries, they're pro-Palestinian, of course. And it's like, yeah, well, they say they are. So it's not only two nations, it's more than that.
Okay.
The main issue is nationalism and the idea of identity. Because in South Africa, pretty much the blacks were asking to have equal rights with the whites, and they all lived under a land which was already known as South Africa and already had defined borders and everything. It was already recognized. So they were just asking for equal rights with an already established identity. They weren't trying to form their own nation. The problem here is you have two countries who are so they're so
Two countries or
stuck,
two nations?
Two
two
nations.
peoples who are so stuck to this idea of there has to be this and this. Like it has to be Israelis and it has to be like the Palestinians, because the Palestinians don't want to integrate with the Israelis because that would get rid of whatever a Palestine is or whatever Palestinians are. And Israelis are afraid that they're going to lose their identity again if Palestinians integrate with them and they claim their own nationality again. So that's the main issue, it's identity. And in South Africa they didn't have to deal with that issue.
Okay, what do you think?
It's basically what he said, since over here there's a question of two states, but in South Africa there was only one, and they were trying to get equal rights. Over here there's the idea of two states.
What are the two states?
Israel and Palestine.
There's a Palestine state?
No, but the Palestinians are seeking a Palestinian state, while Israel, they already have a state, but they only want one Israeli state without the existence of a Palestinian one. And that's what's different about both cases.
Here, the Israelis believe they really believe that this is their land. And the problem is that the Palestinians also believe that this is their land. So I think that like both of them believe that, some believe that they want to kick out the Palestinians, and some believe kick out the Israelis. So they don't believe peace is possible. They don't believe this. They want what's like we said, equal rights, the freedom of movement. But now like people are going to prisons and dying, children dying, and yeah, this is the problem. That's like still now there's conflicts, protests, and this is why it's more complicated.
Well, let's look at it in a different way. Let me give you some examples why I think actually this situation here in Palestine is actually a lot easier to solve. Number one, Israelis and Palestinians are actually very similar. The whites in South Africa and the blacks in South Africa were very different. The millions of blacks in South Africa were millions of very poor, uneducated people. And the whites lived in their own little kind of European, Western world, and absolutely had no connection with all these millions of poor, uneducated people. That doesn't exist here. Israelis and Palestinians are both very educated societies with traditions of, democracy and having their own, their own governments and stuff like that. Okay. If tomorrow, for example, you had freedom of movement, anybody who's a doctor could work in any hospital. Anybody who's an engineer or teacher could teach anywhere, right? Anybody who was a laborer can go and work anywhere. Okay. So you don't have to deal with that. Most Israelis came from where?
Europe.
Arabs were supporting.
The majority of Israelis are not the children of Jews who came from Europe. The majority of Israelis are the children of Jewish people who came from Iraq, from Syria, from the Maghreb, from Yemen, from Lebanon, from Egypt. The majority of Israelis are actually the children of Arab Jews. If the kids your age don't speak Arabic, their parents speak Arabic. Their grandparents for sure speak Arabic. And when you talk to them, they'll tell you, I'm Moroccan, or I am Yemenite, or I am Iraqi. Even today, the children your age, they were born here, their parents were born here, but they'll say, we are Iraqis, or we are Iraqi and Moroccan. They'll still say it. So even culturally, most Israelis are closer to Palestinians than, certainly whites and blacks in South Africa. Or certainly lots of other countries. There are many, many countries around the world. Anybody been to Belgium? There are very clear differences between the two sides of Belgium, but it's one country, two nations, or Switzerland. There are lots of examples where two nations, they don't necessarily love each other, and perhaps they were at war for a very long time, but they were able to create a democracy with equality. So the state, it's not a Jewish state, it's not an Arab state, it's just a state, it's just a democracy, everybody votes. You can have a Palestinian prime minister, an Israeli prime minister, it doesn't matter. But you have complete equality in that you can travel anywhere you want, you can have citizenship, you can have the same rights. You don't have military occupation, you don't need permits to go from Rajala to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, all that kind of stuff. In many other countries, many other places around the world, we've seen this. They used to say there are three problems in the world that will never be solved. South Africa, Ireland, and Palestine. South Africa, solved. Well, they worked on it, but the apartheid fell. Ireland, they made peace. So, what's left? And I would argue, and I'll just say this is my last, and then I'll finish. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that in all of our lifetimes, you guys are going to see a real democracy here, where the rights of Israelis and the rights of Palestinians will be exactly the same.
Problems will still
And
occur.
more and more people around the world are seeing this. More and more people around the world are supporting the Palestinian cause. More and more people in America, even Jewish people in America, are becoming more supportive of this idea of the Palestinian cause. So I would urge you, number one, to get involved. Number two, to develop hope or to find hope. Because when you have hope, then you do more. And this is your country, this is your future. Haifa and Yafa and the Negev, any other place is just as much your home as it is any Israeli. So I again encourage you to think about this and develop hope, because in my opinion, there's absolutely no question in my mind that we're all going to see this, and we're going to see this a lot sooner than most people think. Okay, thank you guys very much. Sure.
Question. Welcome.
Go ahead.
How old were you when you kind of started changing your views about Palestine?
Well, it was gradual, but it started, probably the biggest push was after my niece was killed and I began meeting Palestinians. Because until then I really didn't know anything, you know. So it's a terrible thing to start thinking when something like that happens, but quite often that's what gets us thinking. And it's not just me, my sister and her husband and their other children have all become activists, and they're all talking about Palestine and so on, and reconciliation. But it was a very gradual process, and it was actually a very painful process too. Because you grow up believing something, and you grow up being very proud of something, and suddenly, here I was, this very proud Israeli, I was meeting the Palestinians, and they weren't terrorists, and they weren't crazy, and they weren't monsters. They were just really nice people that, you know, like I said, we were living in America and so on. And we got along very well, and they were telling me a story that I just couldn't believe, because it was completely the opposite of the story that I knew. I didn't think my story was true. I knew my story was true, because my parents lived through that whole time. So it was very, it took a long time. It took years, and it took a lot of getting over fear and getting over a lot of prejudice. I remember in the book I described the first time I drove by myself into the West Bank. And I was driving with an Israeli car, with the yellow license plates. And I got off the main road, and I was in the West Bank, and suddenly I thought, oh my God, I'm going to die. I mean, there's going to be somebody here to kill me, because Palestinians are obviously out there waiting. And it wasn't rational. I mean, it was a crazy idea, and I knew it was stupid. But I couldn't help it. All these old fears kept coming up, you know. And so I was already an adult, you know. It was probably a process that began about 15 years ago or something like that. And then every so often it would, it would become stronger and stronger.
Wait,
Yeah.
I have to ask. Does that mean that you served in the Israeli army? How was it like?
You're gonna have to buy and read my book. All the answers are in my book, but I'll tell you briefly. There's a chapter in my book about you have my book, right? There's a chapter in my book about the military service, because for a while there was a little conflicted, about the army, because I knew about the occupation, I knew it was wrong, so I was kind of conflicted. But then all my friends went, so I went, and I wanted to be a good soldier and stuff like that. And gradually, as I was in the military, this is a long time ago, this was before the Intifada, the first Intifada or anything like that. So there was nothing dramatic happening, but I could just see from the attitude of the officers and the attitude of the soldiers, this had nothing to do with security. This had everything to do with terrorizing the Palestinians. It had nothing to do, the work we did had nothing to do with security. So by the end of 3 years, I regretted that I served. I regretted that I didn't refuse. That was probably my biggest regret. I talk about it in the book. When I was finished with the 3 years, I looked back and I wished that I refused to serve, because this military army is a terrorist organization. It is not a moral army. It is not really, I don't really think it's an army. I think it's a big, well-funded terrorist organization. But I probably wouldn't have, I don't know if I would have known that if I hadn't served. So that was my experience. Let's see in the back there, yeah.
Do you have any children?
I do.
And what do they think about the whole situation?
Well, my kids grew up in America. I live in America, so my kids grew up in America. My oldest son is 20. He's in college. And he's very much involved with the Palestinian cause. And when he comes to visit here, he goes to Masra and places like that to protest and things like that. My other two kids are a little bit younger, so they're not really, they don't really know much about it.
They're not confused.
They're not confused, no. I make sure they're not confused. Yes.
Do you think that the Middle Eastern countries would agree to a one state with both Jews and Arabs, since most of them pretty much hate the Jews?
I don't think anybody matters. People ask that about the other Arab countries, or they ask that, they say, well, the Israelis will never agree. I don't think it matters. You know, America will never agree. I don't think that matters either. Because I think history has its own mechanism, has its own process. You know, people in America did not like Nelson Mandela. People in America thought Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. People in America were against boycotting South Africa. You know, when activists would talk about South Africa, it would be like talking about Palestine today. Americans and American businesses and American banks and American politicians did not want to oppose apartheid in South Africa. Who won? Nelson Mandela. People, I don't know, you guys, this is even longer time ago, okay? There used to be a country called South Vietnam. And just before South Vietnam disappeared, an American president swore that America will never stop supporting South Vietnam. There's no South Vietnam. People spoke. Americans said enough is enough. We don't want to give that place the money anymore. We don't want to give that place soldiers anymore, and so on. So the fact that people who are strong want something or disagree with something doesn't necessarily mean anything. Israelis will never, if you took a poll, if you waited your whole life and tried to convince Israelis that what they're doing is wrong and democracy is actually better for them as well, they'll never agree. If you waited until all the white people in South Africa agreed to end apartheid, it would never end. Because people who have privileges want their privileges. They never agreed to share. But one day they wake up and the world changes. You know? And so, right now, who knows what people in Arab countries think because they don't have democracies, right? They've got dictators, and these dictators quite often are supported by Israel and America. So there's a problem there. But I think if you had democracies in the Arab world, you wouldn't have, nobody would make peace with Israel. You know, that's kind of one of those things that's well known. So they might agree, they might disagree. I don't think they're relevant anymore. I don't think anybody can stand in the way of the process that's moving Palestine from where it is today into being a real democracy with equal rights. I don't think anything can stand in their way.
You don't think like it would cause any enemies, like Iran, for example?
Maybe. It could be. But I think the process is stronger than that. You know, I think it's a stronger process than anything else. I think Israelis and Palestinians are unique. And again, I don't talk about Jews and Palestinians. I don't think all Jews, you know, have a right to live here. Israelis were born here. You know, our parents and grandparents were settlers and colonizers, but you know, it's like the whites in South Africa. This is our country now too. This is our home now too. But Israelis and Palestinians are very unique because these are two very highly educated societies, very productive societies that have been involved in business and politics and technology and everything that's going on for such a small country. I don't think anybody can stand in the way of bringing these two societies to a place where they can live like normal people. Nothing can stand in this way. I don't think anything is strong enough to stop it. You know, that's why that's why I say I don't think it's going to take very long. I mean, already right now we're about half and half. Maybe Israelis are 6.5 million, Palestinians are about 6 million. By 2020, there's going to be a Palestinian majority here. You know, by 2020, Gaza is going to have 500,000 more people in Gaza. So are they still going to live through tunnels, bring food through tunnels? I mean, it's a crazy idea. Besides being wrong morally, I think the reality here is not sustainable. It's impossible to continue to keep this going. So Iran might have an opinion, and Jordan might have an opinion, and Egypt, Sisi might. I mean, it's not going to make any difference. There's a process here that I think is stronger than anything else. Anybody else? Yeah. Last question. Go ahead.
Who's going to be behind that process?
Who?
Yeah.
Me.
All of you, all of us, everybody.
That's us against 7 other billion people.
Not exactly. It's not exactly you against 7 other billion people, because not all Israelis are in the process, right? You have a political system. It's again, I think South Africa is a good example. But there are other examples around the world where you had a system that was not a democratic system, and many people supported it. So. And then that system changed and became a democracy. That, you know, if you look at South America, Latin America, all of Latin America used to be dictatorships. You know, Spain used to be a dictatorship in my lifetime, in Greece. You know, of course, going back to South Africa, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's going to happen like this. But I'm saying it is a process that nobody can stop because it's so powerful. Now, there is a Palestinian resistance. There is a movement going on around the world. I have a friend who called it a global intifada, a world intifada. with the BDS and the Popular Resistance, and there's a lot of pro-Palestinian groups around the world. Churches, in America, churches were always coming to Israel to support Israel. Now churches are coming here to support Palestine, in America. So there's a whole world of kind of, like I said, kind of a global intifada taking place that's changing how people view Palestine. Yes?
You mentioned thinking that one state solution is like more accurate or something. What do you actually think is the ideal solution for the situation?
I think there's nothing better for Israelis and Palestinians than living as equals in a democracy.
What would the name of the country?
Whatever you want it to be.
But that's not actually how it's going to be.
I know.
What
Look,
do you think it would be?
I don't know, to call it Palestine/Israel. I don't call it whatever they want. Who cares? I think what's important is this.
The name is not.
I think the important thing is to get to a point where Israelis and Palestinians function as equals. So if you ask me, well, how's it going to happen? If you take an example. In South Africa one day there was a president who realized it's over. And he went up and he made a statement and he said Nelson Mandela will be released unconditionally. And everybody knew that when Nelson Mandela is released unconditionally, it's the end of apartheid. And he said all the political parties that were banned, there were many political parties that opposed apartheid that were banned, are now unbanned, are now, legal. And that was the beginning of the end. And I'm telling you, there's going to be an Israeli prime minister who's going to say the same thing. And it's going to be much sooner than you think. And then you have elections. And imagine if all Israelis and Palestinians went to elections together.
I have a thought, I have a question regarding that. And I don't, in this part of the world, there's a long history of killing those guys. I mean, really, the guys that say that, the equivalent of a de Klerk or a Mandela. Here, they tend to shoot. Whether that's Rabin or Sadat or, Hussein's granddad, they tend to shoot those guys here. So how is that gonna?
Well,
not to be the pessimist in the group, but there's a long history of that not going well in this part of the world.
I'm not sure I accept the premise that either King Abdallah, Sadat, or Rabin were killed because they wanted peace. I think they were killed for other reasons.
Okay.
Rabin was the architect of Oslo, which was not a peace agreement. Oslo was a surrender. Oslo was not meant to bring peace. Oslo was meant to bring the Palestinians to surrender. And when people say Oslo failed, they're wrong. Oslo succeeded. What we see today are the direct results of the Oslo Agreement.
But it is perceived that way, and I mean,
Rabin was killed by someone, and you have to you have to understand and have an insight into Israeli society. Rabin stood for the Ashkenazi elite, this generation of the Palmach who created the state and believed in this white Ashkenazi dream of having the state here. He was killed by someone who was directly the opposite of that. He was a religious man. He had that settler mentality. He came from an Arab background. He came from a deprived background. And the differences between what Rabin represented and what the Galamir represented are two entirely different worlds that clashed. And the process of Oslo was one aspect of that. The thought that he's selling out. But that was only one aspect of why Rabin was killed. I think, and I would argue if Rabin was alive, nothing would have been different. Nothing at all in terms of Palestine. Maybe other countries, something would have been different. But in terms of Palestine, nothing would have been different because Rabin signed the Oslo Accord, and what we see today are the results of the Oslo Accord. The success of the Oslo Accord is more settlements and occupation becoming stronger, and the Palestinians having less and less chance of ever creating a Palestinian state. Because by 1993, there was no more chance for a Palestinian state anyway. There was no West Bank really anymore by 1993, which is why Rabin agreed to sign the Oslo Accords. It wasn't that he changed and he was going to bring peace. So I think that's a misunderstanding. I think with Sadat, it was more an issue between him and the Muslim Brotherhood than anything else, And Abdallah, there are other reasons. I won't get into that right now, but there are other reasons of collaboration and so forth with Zionists and selling out. So these were the bigger issues.
Yeah, but even use the term selling out then. So if you're perceived as a sellout.
True, but creating a democracy with equal rights is not a sellout. creating a democracy with equal rights is not a sellout.
It's gonna be a tough sell.
It's going to be a tough sell, and I'm not saying it's going to be a perfect, easy thing to do. It's going to be a tough uphill battle. There's no question about that. But I think many of the people who have the answers are actually sitting in Israeli jails. And people say, well, where's the Palestinian, where's the Nelson Mandela? There are thousands of them in Israeli jails, and I know many of them. I know many of them who sat in jail and came out. You know. So, do I think it's going to be simple? No, it's going to be an uphill battle. Israel's not going to say, okay, I'm going to disappear one day. At the same time, I think it's from what I see, this is a struggle that's taking place. It's very effective. It's very strong, and I think it's unstoppable. You know, even if you just look at the unsustainability of the reality today. I'll give you another example. I know you guys have questions. I'll give you another example. You know, at Hadassah Hospital, we have Palestinian doctors. You know, my mother had surgery at Hadassah Hospital. The surgeon was a Palestinian, and the anesthesiologist was a Palestinian, and half the nurses are Palestinians. There are even Palestinian doctors in hospitals in the settlements in the West Bank. You know. But the problem is that the doctor who treated my mother so well, and he's a brilliant doctor, a brilliant surgeon, what happens when he goes to Tel Aviv airport? He's treated suddenly like a criminal. For the second he walks in, not even before he walks in, when he gets off the ramp, when he gets off the highway, at the checkpoint, he's already a criminal. And he's a doctor, and he's a good man, and he pays his taxes, and never broke the law in his life, okay? From that on, for the next 5 hours, he's going to be terrorized by young Israeli security agents, you know, only because he's a Palestinian. Then once he gets in, he's going to have to do strip search and all these horrific things for hours, 3, 4, 5 hours, right?
We don't work here.
I'm sure you do. And so, and then he's going to be taken. This is not only wrong, it's impossible to sustain. It's impossible to sustain. It would be different if you had like masses of poor, ignorant, uneducated people. That's not the reality here. You know, this is not going to continue very much longer. I don't think this is unsustainable. Besides being, you know, morally repugnant, it's unsustainable. Okay, let's take 2 more questions before I lose my voice. Somebody who hasn't asked anything or said anything. Go ahead.
If it was a one-state solution, how do you think the government would work out? And having equal representation and dealing with water on both sides?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look, there's lots of examples around the world of how it works. Lots of examples around the world of how it works. Now, again, I think the one state is already here. It's just not a democratic state. So saying the one state is just here. It's not, what we're talking about is changing it to a democracy, so you do have access to the same water and the same rights.
Not just that, then you have 2 different religions. Like
You
our
do.
government. Three. And then 3, yeah, my bad.
Yeah, you can have, look, you can have 2 different religions. Right.
Problem.
There are many countries around the world where you have more than two languages and 3 religions. You know, there are lots of countries around the world that function very well with many religions and many languages, as long as they put together some kind of a system that works. So I'll tell you what I think. Okay, now there are a lot of different models. I'll tell you what I think. Okay, Israel is not really a democracy for Israelis either, because you know when you vote, there are no districts, there are no areas. In a normal democracy, they slice the country into little pieces, and every piece has a representative, and you vote for the representative. Israel doesn't have that. Everybody votes for the party. You don't know who your representative is. So after you vote, you don't know what's going to happen, because the party does whatever they want. Okay? It's not like in England or in America, where you vote for a particular person, and that person then goes to Parliament or whatever, and they have to do what you want them to do. They're your representative. So Israel is not really a democracy. So imagine if there's a new political system. It's not a Zionist system anymore. We're talking about the end of the Zionist regime. That's what I'm talking about, okay, to make it absolutely clear. Then they will have to divide Israel into, any normal democracy has to have districts. So they divide the country into districts. Okay? So let's say your parents are Palestinians and I'm, they're probably about my age, I'll just guess, okay? And we're both in the same district. Okay, I live in Jerusalem, this is Bejala. It would be impossible to make, districts that are only Palestinian or Israeli because it's all too close, okay? So, and then we have to go to elections and we vote. And they have a vote and I have a vote and our vote is equal. And then we decide who you like best. So I like somebody, and he may be a Palestinian, maybe an Israeli, and I vote for that person. And they like somebody, maybe an Israeli, maybe a Christian, maybe a Muslim, and they vote for that person. You know, and little by little, what happens when you do that is people live a normal life. And when people live a normal life, which is what most people do, most Israelis and most Palestinians are not crazy fanatics. They just want to, you know, send their kids to school and have a normal life. You know, and then the people who are crazy suddenly lose their power. People who are fanatic, their power becomes smaller and smaller because people are managing to live their life normally. You see, and so there are lots of models of normal democracies that have changed from being something like this to being a normal democracy that we can follow. I think that happens to be a good one. But in the end, Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to get together in some kind of interim government and decide how they're going to do this. And maybe have a constitution. Israel doesn't have a constitution. Maybe not. I don't know. Change what kind of a name is it going to be called? How do you compensate? What do you do with the right of return? 4 million Palestinians have a right to return. They should be allowed to come back and live in their countries, or at least get some kind of compensation. That has to be resolved. That has to be resolved. That's a good question. That has to be resolved. You know, these are all questions that can only be resolved after you have a democracy and Israelis and Palestinians work together and vote together and create a system that can answer all these questions.
Well, the first thing that has to happen is settlements should stop.
That's right. Settlements should stop. The refugees have to be allowed to return. The prisoners have to be released. All of these things, water has to be arranged, compensation. These are big issues, but they can't be solved by one side alone. They can only be solved when you have democracy with both sides together. So you guys vote, and Israelis vote, and then you're probably going to have some kind of a mix of an Israeli-Palestinian government, which is how it's supposed to be. And then they'll figure it out. Okay, last question. So somebody who hasn't said anything at all evening. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So you know,
Shh.
organizations like Seeds of Peace, Hands of Peace, Arts of Peace, you know, those things. What do you think of those organizations? And do you feel like they should be boycotted, or should they be encouraged? And you know.
What do you think?
I have mixed opinions.
That's good. What are your mixed opinions?
Well, my parents influenced me to think that they're acts of normalization and that we should boycott them. But I see that they like encourage friendships and like, because my friends, they all participate in these kind of things. So I see that they encourage friendships and, you know, I feel like they do get somewhere to an extent.
You know, I think the only person who can answer that question for you is you, because in general, is normalization a good thing? No. I agree with your parents. I think there shouldn't be normalization. At the same time, if Israelis and Palestinians never meet, if I never went to a discussion group with Palestinians, I would never have known what I know. Okay? And I remember having this conversation with somebody who works in Ramallah, Palestinian, that works with the BDS group. And we were talking, and he said, oh, wait a minute, that means meeting Israelis is maybe a good thing, because that's how you change. So I think when you have a struggle, it's very important to keep an open mind. You have to have certain rules. I think boycott is the right thing, and so forth. At the same time, you cannot be too strict with yourself. You have to try and see how it works. Does it seem like normalization? Are these people going back and joining the army? Because if they're joining the army, it's obviously pointless. Are these people now refusing to join the army? So now maybe you've made a change. You see? If these Israelis go back and join the army, what's the point of talking to them? If they go back and they refuse, and they're demonstrating solidarity with Palestine, and they're demonstrating solidarity with Palestinian struggle, that's a whole different story. Then that's not normalization anymore. Does that make sense? So you need to give yourself some room to make mistakes. And maybe you'll do one thing, it'll be wrong, and then you'll learn from it, and the next time you'll do it differently. But you have to give yourself room, especially as you're growing up, to ask questions and to make mistakes. Because it's never 100% black and white. So you try it, and you see what happens. And what are these Israelis like? What do they talk about? What do they think? You know, how do they respond to the Palestinian struggle? And then you make up your own mind. That's what I'm saying.
What do you think about the fact that most of these organizations, they happen either in Israel or in America or some other place? The fact that they don't come to Palestine itself is kind of, you know, what I mean, what I'm saying.
Yeah, you're right. If they're not coming, if they don't go to Palestine, if they're afraid to come here, then it's probably a waste of time.
All of them are. All of them are the same thing.
And so that's how it is. You're right. I don't know about all of them because I don't know all of them. But obviously you guys know, and so you follow what you think is right. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think just because somebody's willing to meet a Palestinian that makes them, you know, Gandhi. At the same time, you don't want to reject if somebody, but I think it's very important for people to come here. I think Israelis that are not willing to come here, there's nothing to talk about. You know what I mean? But then, allow yourself to check it out and make mistakes, and then you'll know. All right? Okay, that was 2 questions, right? Okay, thank you guys very much.
Can I ask one more?
Okay.
I'm just curious, I'm sorry to keep bugging you. When you make this kind of presentation to an Israeli group,
Never happened.
They never allowed you? You never?
It's not that it never allowed me, I just don't get invited. Israelis do not want to hear anything outside the Zionist parameters. They don't want to hear anything outside the Zionist parameters. It's not something they want to discuss, you know, because the Zionism is so much a part of who we are and the struggle and so forth. So they don't want to hear anything outside of that, of that. And I've jumped that fence a long time ago. So if I was invited, I'd speak, but I don't typically get invited. I mean, the Israelis that I do know are activists and pretty much think like me. So
you talk to Palestinians and non-Israelis?
I talk to whoever it is that wants to listen.
Which is usually.
Huh? If I'm here, it's usually either foreigners or Palestinians and maybe a few Israelis. And when I'm overseas, which is when I talk most of the time, then I talk to a lot of people. Yeah, a lot of people.
That's why the first time I listened to an Israeli person told the truth. Yeah, the first time.
Well, thank you.
All my life. But I know that there is many like his now. I know there is many like his. Here in British and America, everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.